3 frames had died overnight. One was left. I walked to it the way you walk toward something, when you are not sure you want to know what you will find. Slowly. My boots pressed through the frozen crust of the enclosure floor, and the cold came up through the leather the way cold always finds its way in. Not all at once, but by degrees, patient and thorough, and completely indifferent to what you needed from it. It was January of 1884. I was 66 years old. My husband Edmund and I had arrived at Red Hollow Basin, Montana 3 years before, after 6 years following survey crews across Nebraska and the Dakota line. And in those 3 years, I had filled 4 leather ledgers with temperature readings and wind charts and frost maps and the particular kind of notes that people in town had decided were evidence that I had lost my practical sense, somewhere between the cliff wall and the notebooks. The temperature had been 24 below zero for 6 days. The first frame had collapsed in the night. The support poles buckled under the ice. Weight the muslin lying flat against the frozen ground with the dead seedlings pressed beneath it. The second had frozen solid, the cloth transformed into something resembling thin white ceramic that did not flex when I pressed my thumb against it. The third had been pushed inward by snow accumulating against the outer wall. The supports bowed sideways, everything that had been growing inside somewhere underneath. I stood between the third frame and the fourth. I breathed slowly, then I walked to the fourth. It was positioned closest to the cliff at the lowest point of the interior curve, where the sandstone face had been absorbing and releasing heat since the wall was first complete. The muslin was crusted with frost on the outside. The support poles had held. I lifted the edge of the cloth with hands that were shaking, and I lowered myself until I was close enough to the ground to see what was inside. One plant, a single miner's lettuce seedling barely the size of my thumb, still standing upright, still alive. I put the thermometer inside the frame and waited on my knees in the snow while the reading settled. Then I took the second thermometer from my coat pocket and held it in the open air beyond the wall. 21 degrees below zero inside the enclosure, 22 below zero in the open basin, 1 degree. I had spent 3 years and everything I owned building toward 1 degree of difference. Kneeling in the dark beside the only living thing left in that enclosure, I finally understood what I had actually built. Not a wall, not a growing system. Something older than either of those things. A way of refusing to lose by exactly the margin that mattered. That is where the story ends. What follows is where it began. The stone held warmth long after the sun had gone. That was the first thing Evelyn Calloway noticed about Red Hollow Basin, and she noticed it the way she had learned to notice everything over 6 years of following survey crews across Nebraska and the Dakota line. Not with excitement, not with a plan already forming. She noticed it with the quiet, careful attention of a woman who had spent years reading land, the way other people read faces, pressing her instincts against the evidence before she trusted either one. She was 63 years old when she pressed the back of her hand against the face of that sandstone cliff for the first time, and she had arrived at 63, the way most women who have lived honestly arrive at that age with considerably more certainty than people gave her credit for and considerably less patience for things that were not worth her time. The rest of Red Hollow Basin had already turned cold. Shadows had swallowed the valley floor in the hour before she found the cliff, and the temperature around her was dropping with the particular efficiency of Montana air once the sun loses its angle. But the cliff was different. The long wall of red sandstone rising behind the dry gulch on the southeastern edge of the property still gave back the day's heat in slow, faint pulses against her skin, like breath from a sleeping creature, not yet ready to let the warmth go. She said it quietly to no one in particular. That rock is holding the day longer. Edmund had not heard her. He stood a few yards behind her boots, planted in the gravel, studying the terrain, with the expression of a man calculating the cost of something in labor. He was 65, broad through the shoulders, the kind of man who did not waste words but never wasted effort either. He could look at a piece of land and see what it would demand from him. Right now, standing at the edge of Red Hollow Basin, in the spring of 1881, it was demanding quite a lot. Harlan Shaw stood a few feet farther back, arms folded, watching Evelyn with the patient expression of a man who had walked many settlers across this same ground and had given up expecting them to surprise him. He was not a cruel man. He had explained the property that afternoon without decoration or apology. The soil ran alkaline through most of the basin. Red stone sat close to the surface and made plowing expensive. The growing season stayed short, even in generous years. Wind funneled hard down from the Absaroka foothills once winter settled in crossing the valley floor at strange angles that kept experienced farmers from sleeping well in January. Most people in the surrounding town agreed the land was best suited for grazing thin cattle and educating hopeful newcomers about the particular lessons of Montana. He had said all of this standing in the open, and Evelyn had listened without changing her expression. What she had not done was look away from the cliff. She lowered her hand from the stone, now brushed the reddish dust from her palm, and said nothing more to either man. She turned and began walking back toward the wagon, and her expression gave away nothing at all. But she carried what she had felt through her skin. She would carry it through 2 full winters before she fully understood what it meant. And she would carry it much longer after she did. They had arrived in Red Hollow Basin, following 6 years with the survey crews. Edmund had worked freight supply routes, pushing north ahead of the expanding rail network. Evelyn had gone with him because she had no interest in waiting at home while the world moved without her, and because she had discovered something useful about herself during those years on the road. She was good at reading land, not the formal kind of reading with instruments and recorded calculations, though she had learned enough working alongside the crew, surveyors, to manage those as well. What she was good at was the quieter kind. The kind that came from paying attention over long periods to things most people considered too small to notice. 6 years of watching where frost settled first and thawed last, where standing water chose to pool after heavy rain, where livestock instinctively moved when the temperature dropped in the evening, where wildflowers found the courage to grow in otherwise bare hillsides, where certain rocks held the afternoon light against their surfaces an hour after the meadow grass around them had gone cold and dark. She had filled 3 leather ledgers with those observations. Small, precise entries, temperature readings, wind direction notes, frost depth comparisons across different soil types, where stone held heat and shadow longer than surrounding ground. The survey men had called her the one who watches. They meant it as a mild joke. Evelyn accepted the description without correction because it was accurate. When she and Edmund came to Red Hollow Basin, she brought those 3 ledgers with her. She also brought a 4th empty one bound in tobacco, brown leather, with 200 blank pages waiting. The first season confirmed everything Harlan Shaw had promised, without promising anything. The soil was difficult. The growing season was short. The cabin they repaired that spring was solid enough, but the land around it offered very little cooperation. Edmund planted 2 rows of garden vegetables in the cleared ground south of the cabin in late May. By early July, the beans looked decent, the turnips had come in reasonably well, and Edmund had developed a private optimism about the corn that Evelyn quietly did not share. The first hard freeze arrived on the 9th of October. It was earlier than the neighbors had predicted, and more decisive than either Calloway had hoped. By the morning of the 11th, the garden was gone. not damaged, not struggling, gone. The bean rows lay flat and blackened against the frozen soil. The turnips had split in the ground overnight. The corn stalks stood stiff and gray above a surface that felt like packed iron underfoot. Edmund stood at the garden's edge and looked at the destroyed rows without speaking. Evelyn stood beside him. She was not looking at the rows. She was looking past them toward the narrow strip along the base of the sandstone cliff, where the snow from the previous night had already vanished. The dark stone and its residual warmth had refused to let the frost settle there, 10 inches wide, perhaps 12, but clear. She wrote it down that evening. Temperature at dawn. Wind direction. Which sections of ground had frozen hardest overnight, and which had held a trace of softness. Where ice had formed nearly 2 inches thick versus where it barely reached half of that. At the bottom of the page, she added a small note. Snow vanishes first at the base of the cliff. Ground stays softer nearest the dark stone. Worth further study when conditions allow. Edmund read the entry over her shoulder without speaking. He went to bed. Evelyn turned to the next blank page. Red Hollow Basin formed its opinion of the Callaways during that first winter, and the opinion it formed moved in one direction. Garrett Dunn was the loudest voice. He ran cattle on the western ground of the basin, a broad man with a habit of positioning himself outside the saloon on Friday afternoons when foot traffic through town was at its highest. He had assessed Edmund and found him adequate. He had assessed Evelyn and found her puzzling. The leather notebook she carried to places where no notebook had any reasonable purpose was the first thing he mentioned. The second was her habit of pressing her bare hand against rock walls at odd hours of the day. The third, which he delivered to the men outside the saloon that January to considerable appreciation, was his conclusion about what the Callaway woman thought she was doing with that canyon behind her cabin. She plans to grow supper out of the canyon walls, he said. And the laughter that followed was the comfortable kind, the laughter of people reassured that someone else had stepped forward to fail first. Pastor Owen Cutter addressed the matter from the pulpit the following Sunday morning as he addressed most matters of community concern, which is to say carefully and from a principled distance. He did not use names. He spoke about the particular vanity of people who mistake persistence for wisdom, about the danger of continuing down a wrong path because the alternative required admitting error before an entire community. He said all of it with the measured warmth of a man convinced he was offering a correction as a kindness early enough to be useful. Nobody in the church building misunderstood who he was speaking about. 2 days after that sermon, Mabel Cutter arrived at the Callaway cabin, carrying a wrapped loaf of fresh bread. She was the pastor's wife, a woman of careful social authority, the kind built over many years by being exactly as useful as each situation required, and no more. She sat at the kitchen table and spoke pleasantly about the weather, the condition of the road north, the difficulty of obtaining quality flour before the supply wagons resumed their spring routes. Then she arrived at what she had actually come to say. She asked Evelyn gently and without malice whether she truly intended to stay through another winter there. Evelyn poured more coffee into Mabel's cup and did not answer immediately. She looked toward the north window, the one that faced up basin, where the worst wind originated. Then she turned back to Mabel and asked a question of her own. How long does snow stay against your north fence in February? Mabel frowned slightly. She was not certain what that had to do with anything. She offered a cautious estimate. 3 weeks, usually after the last serious fall. Evelyn nodded once, as though this confirmed something she had been thinking about. She did not explain what. Mabel finished her coffee and made a gracious exit and spent the walk home trying to understand what the question had meant. She had not worked it out by the time she reached her door. Evelyn spent the rest of that winter watching the wind. She rose before dawn 3 mornings out of every 5 and walked the basin in the dark, testing the ground with her bare hands while Edmund was still sleeping. She learned where the frost settled deepest. She learned where the wind split around the eastern ridge and doubled back on itself. She found a section of ground near the cliff base where the soil stayed measurably warmer than the open valley floor during the coldest hours before sunrise. Not warm enough to grow anything, not warm enough to show on someone else's thermometer, but enough to record in the ledger with the words she kept coming back to. The stone remembers. She tied strips of cloth to a row of survey stakes she had driven along the property line and watched the fabric move during wind shifts, tracking patterns in the ledger with small arrows and numbers and diagrams she drew from memory each evening by lamplight. The second winter produced only slightly better results in the garden, but it produced considerably more data. By spring of 1882, the first leather ledger had been filled and joined by a second, its pages dense with temperature readings and frost maps and wind direction notes assembled from 60 separate morning walks. Edmund read the entries when Evelyn was not looking, with the patient expression of a man who trusted his wife's intelligence more thoroughly than he understood her methods. He asked very few questions. He was always there when she needed another pair of hands. Garrett Dunn had a new line by spring. He said the Calloway woman was documenting her own failure in a book, and she had filled so many pages that the failure was beginning to look like the point. He told it at the saloon with the practiced ease of a man warming a reliable joke for 2 seasons. Evelyn did not respond. She was already past responding. She had started running experiments. Low piles of dark gravel positioned against the cliff base, which she had observed absorbed and held measurably more heat during daylight hours than the pale-colored soil of the open ground. Shallow trenches dug beneath flat stone slabs to retain warmth in the ground overnight. A small section of muslin stretched over a cedar frame coated with boiled linseed oil to create a crude, transparent surface that might trap warmth beneath it, the way glass traps a room's heat on a south-facing winter afternoon. She planted seedlings beneath the muslin frame in early April, before any reasonable planting date, by any reckoning to test what the trapped warmth would do. For 11 days it worked. The temperature beneath the cloth ran 6 degrees above the open ground. The seedlings pushed upward, with a confidence that felt in those 11 days like something real was happening. Then a wet freeze moved through Red Hollow overnight without warning. She found the frame in the gray morning light with moisture condensed and refrozen solid on the inside of the muslin. The seedlings beneath had died standing upright, killed not by cold descending from above, but by a thin layer of ice that had formed within the shelter she had built around them. She stood over the frame for a long time in the early morning, cold hands in her coat pockets, looking at the dead plants without touching them. She sat down in the frost beside the frame and opened the ledger across her knee. Outside temperature at freeze time, wind direction before and after midnight, moisture level at planting depth. She recorded every measurement she could recall. Then at the bottom of the entry, she wrote the thing she had actually learned. The cover trapped warmth, but also trapped moisture. Cold entered from the ground beneath the growing bed, not from the air above it. The system needed drainage below the roots, not only protection above them. She looked at the dead seedlings one more moment. Then she turned to the next page. There is a particular quality of attention that has nothing to do with effort or ambition. It is the quality of a mind that has learned to stay quiet long enough for the thing it is watching to reveal its own character without being asked. Evelyn had spent most of her adult life developing that quality, and it was this quality on a late July evening in 1882 that finally showed her the answer she had been working toward without knowing exactly what shape it would take. She had climbed the slope above the dry gulch to check a higher row of cloth strips she had staked there to capture the upper wind patterns before they descended to the valley floor. A stronger gust came down from the foothills and moved through the line of stakes, and she watched the strips below her go horizontal in the wind, pointing hard south. Standard. Expected. But the strips positioned directly downhill of a large irregular boulder on the slope, a block of dark stone that had broken away from the ridge at some point before anyone was keeping records, did something different. They moved sideways first. Then they curled slightly around the stone, the fabric tracing the outline of the airflow as it divided around the obstacle in its path. Then they reconverged 15 yards below it, coming back together as a single current that continued south as though nothing had interrupted it. The wind had not fought the boulder. It had not simply deflected away from it. It had bent around the obstacle, split into two quieter paths on either side, past the stone in a calmer state, and rejoined on the far side without losing its direction. Evelyn stood on the slope and watched the cloth strips settle back to their resting positions after the gust passed. She looked at the boulder. She looked at the space on either side of it where the air had divided and quieted. She looked at the ground directly behind the stone, where the two streams had slowed before finding each other again. Then she opened the ledger and began to draw. Not words this time. A shape. She drew it slowly, building it from the movement she had just witnessed, translated into something deliberate. A wall, but not a straight one. A curve wide at the center, like a bowl turned to face the south. The ends of the curve coming forward and narrowing at the opening, so that wind arriving from the north would split around, the two arms divide into quieter flows along either side, and the interior would receive neither the full force of the cold air rushing through, nor the full stillness of a sealed enclosure. Something in between. Calmer air. Air that would slow and settle, and in settling hold, warmth would have somewhere to gather. She drew the shape from 3 different angles, turning the ledger sideways and back again, working out the proportions, labeling where the opening should face to catch the maximum winter sun on the shortest December days while keeping the worst crosswind from entering straight through the center. She filled 4 pages before the light had dropped too low to see the markings clearly. She walked back down to the cabin in the near dark. Edmund was starting the fire for supper. She set the ledger on the table without opening it, washed her hands, and helped him with the food. She said nothing about what she had drawn that evening, and she said nothing about it the next morning either. She needed to sit with it a while first. Cecilia Holt arrived at the end of August 1882, riding atop a freight wagon stacked with flour sacks and seed bundles, and the kind of tools that suggest a woman who has arrived at decisions before she has arrived at destinations. She was 71 years old, a widow from Iowa Bluff country, who had spent 4 decades watching weather move across exposed farmland, and she had the deliberate stillness of someone who had learned long ago that most of what you needed to understand about a situation would reveal itself to a patient observer if you did not rush in and interrupt it. She and Evelyn had been neighbors in Iowa before the survey years. They had spent 2 winters within walking distance of each other, sharing seeds and opinions and occasional evenings by the fire, and they had formed the quiet, unsentimental bond that sometimes develops between 2 women who recognize in each other a quality of attention the people around them do not share. Evelyn had written to Cecilia in the 2nd year at Red Hollow, not asking for specific help, simply describing what she had been learning and recording, the way she might describe it to herself if she were writing in order to make something clearer. Cecilia had written back 3 months later with 3 words at the bottom of a short page. I am coming. She did not ask for a summary when she arrived. She climbed down from the wagon, accepted a cup of coffee from Evelyn, nodded once at Edmund, and spent the first 2 hours of her visit simply moving around the property, touching things. The soil at the cliff base, the gravel in the shallow experimental piles, the face of the cliff itself, pressing her palm flat against the surface, the same way Evelyn had pressed hers on that first April evening in 1881. She stood still for nearly 20 minutes near the south-facing slope during a wind shift and watched the dust move across the basin floor without saying a word. Edmund returned to his work. Evelyn followed Cecilia at a respectful distance, saying nothing, letting the older woman come to whatever she came to in her own time. On the second evening, Evelyn brought the leather ledger to the table and set it open between them. She turned to the pages from July, the pages with the drawings. Cecilia looked at them for a long time. She looked at the horseshoe shape Evelyn had sketched from 3 angles. She read the notes about the boulder and the cloth strips and the divided current. She studied the dimension estimates and the orientation notations along the margins. Then she picked up the charcoal stub Evelyn used for corrections and stood up from the table without explanation. She walked outside into the evening. Evelyn followed. Cecilia crouched at the edge of the cleared ground near the cabin and drew the shape in the hard earth larger than Evelyn had drawn it in the ledger, the horseshoe curve laid down with a slower, more deliberate hand. The opening aimed southeast toward the cliff, the arms reaching forward, cupping the space where low winter light would enter on December afternoons when the sun crossed at its lowest angle. As she drew the last line, a gust rolled down from the foothills. It split around the shape in the dirt, almost exactly as it had split around the boulder on the slope 5 weeks before. Both women felt it at the same moment. Cecilia set the charcoal down and rose slowly. She looked at the shape she had redrawn in the dust. Then she looked at the cliff above them. Then she looked at the open ledger pages in Evelyn's hands. She did not say, "You have it right," or "This is the answer." She only looked at the drawing with the expression of someone confirming a fact they had already been carrying quietly for some time. Edmund stood at the cabin doorway, watching both of them. Nobody spoke. The wind moved across the basin above them, steady and cold, and the evening light lay copper across the face of the red sandstone cliff. Cecilia went back inside to finish her coffee. The autumn that followed, and the one after it, brought no softening from Red Hollow's settled opinion of the Callaway enterprise. Garrett Dunn had absorbed the information that an older woman from Iowa had arrived to assist in the project and had adjusted his conclusions accordingly, deciding that the effort was not only misguided, but expanding in its misguided direction. He still positioned himself outside the saloon on Fridays. The men who laughed along with him were fewer than they had been the year before, though not so few that he had taken notice. Pastor Owen Cutter had shifted his approach from the pulpit. He no longer addressed stubbornness directly by name. He spoke instead about the spiritual discipline of recognizing the limits that Providence had placed on human ambition, which was a different arrangement of the same idea, and his congregation received it with the same quiet nod they had given the earlier version. Evelyn was not usually in the congregation to hear it. She was usually at the cliff. It was the fall of 1883, when Harlan Shaw arrived at the Callaway cabin on a Tuesday morning with a folded set of papers inside his coat. He came on horseback and dismounted at the gate with the manner of a man who had rehearsed the conversation he was about to have and did not intend to deviate from it. He sat at the kitchen table with the papers open between them and went through the account without rushing it. The balance had reached its limit. He had extended the terms once already in the second year at his own discretion. He was not in a position to extend them again. If the outstanding amount was not settled before the 1st of March, the homestead would revert to his ownership under the original terms of the agreement. Edmund sat very still beside Evelyn. Evelyn listened without interruption. When Shaw finished, he folded the papers in a precise, practiced motion and set them on the edge of the table. He looked at her with the steady expression of a man who had delivered this kind of news many times before, and had decided some years ago not to apologize for what was simply a fact of business. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. Then she said that was a fair account of the situation, and she did not dispute the numbers. Then she asked him one question. "Have you ever stood against that cliff after sunset in January?" Shaw looked at her. Then he looked past her through the kitchen window toward the back of the property, where the long wall of red sandstone rose above the dry gulch in the late afternoon light, still glowing faintly copper while the rest of the valley had already turned cold and gray. He did not answer. He picked up his papers, stood, thanked her for the coffee she had not yet offered, and left. Evelyn sat at the table and listened to his horse moving away down the basin road until she could no longer hear the sound of hooves against the frozen ground. That night, the three of them spread every paper across the kitchen table beneath the oil lamp. Edmund's hands flat on either side of a wind chart, Cecilia's reading glasses resting near her coffee cup. Evelyn standing her palms on the open ledger, reading her own numbers in the lamplight as though she were reading them for the first time. Temperature readings from 20 locations across the property. Frost records from more than 60 separate mornings. Wind direction charts from 2 full winters. Sun angle calculations for the southeastern exposure. 4 pages of horseshoe sketches from that July evening on the slope above the gulch. The numbers told the truth plainly. There was no reasonable route to earning enough money to settle the account before March. The freight work Edmund had been picking up in town would not get them there. There was no cash crop that could be planted, harvested, and converted to payment in time. The arithmetic was honest about this without malice, without apology, without any interest in what the people reading it needed to hear. One possibility remained. The land would have to produce food through the winter. Not in spring when the frost relented and the soil softened and growing became ordinary again. In November and December and January and February, when nothing was supposed to grow in Red Hollow Basin, when the ground locked solid and the wind came hard off the foothills and the people of the valley survived on whatever they had stored and whatever patience they had remaining. In those months, something would have to live and grow inside. The horseshoe wall that Evelyn had drawn in her ledger on that July evening a year before. Edmund read the entries one more time in the lamplight. Then he looked up at Evelyn. She did not ask what he thought. She already knew. He was the kind of man who did not walk away from something he had started. And he had started this on the afternoon in April of 1881, when he had watched his wife press her palm against the canyon wall in the failing light and come away with that quiet, decided expression. Cecilia set her coffee cup down. She said nothing. She had already said what she needed to say in the dirt outside on that August evening the year before. 3 days later, work on the wall began. They rose before the sun, all 3 of them, and carried iron wedges and sledgehammers and cottonwood levers cut from the creek bottoms north of the property, up the southeastern slope in the dark cold of a Montana dawn. The sandstone broke unevenly. Some pieces split clean when the wedge went in true. Others shattered without warning and rolled back down the hillside through loose gravel and frost, and there was nothing to do except climb after them and set the wedge again. Nell, their aging mule, stood at the base of the slope, with the patience of an animal that had hauled impossible loads across frozen ground long enough to know that the load always eventually moved. Her breath came in long white clouds through the cold morning air, steady and unhurried, a kind of company that required nothing of the people working nearby. The rawhide runners beneath the stone sleds screamed across the frozen ground, each time a load shifted sideways on the descent, and that sound traveled across the silent basin, like something that belonged there, like the sound of work that had waited long enough to begin. The horseshoe enclosure took its shape below the cliff face, stone by stone, course by course, in the blue-gray hours of the Montana autumn morning, while the valley lay still around them, and the sun had not yet cleared the eastern ridgeline, and no one in Red Hollow Basin was watching. Wide through the center where Evelyn had calculated that trapped air would slow and settle. Narrow at the southeast opening where winter light would enter during the shortest December afternoons. The northwestern spine growing thicker than the rest, 2 stones deep against the worst of the crosswinds coming off the foothills. There was still a great deal of work ahead. There were failures waiting that none of them could yet anticipate. There were nights coming that would test everything Evelyn had built out of years of observation and patience and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had never once confused what other people said was possible with what she had seen with her own eyes and felt with her own hands. But the wall was rising, and above them, the red sandstone cliff caught the first pale edge of morning light along its upper rim, holding the warmth it would gather through the coming day, already promising to give it back. The wall that rose in those first weeks of October was not the wall Evelyn had imagined when she sketched the horseshoe shape in her ledger on that slope above the gulch. The wall she had imagined in that moment of clarity was a clean and resolute thing, a curve of red sandstone that would sit permanent and purposeful against the Montana sky and perform its function without requiring further instruction. The wall that rose in practice was considerably more honest. It failed in ways that were educational and in ways that were simply infuriating, and it made no distinction between the two. The first problem arrived before November, a section of the northern spine, the thicker portion Evelyn had designed to take the worst of the crosswind, coming off the Absaroka foothills, shifted nearly half an inch after a hard, overnight freeze lifted the ground beneath 3 of the foundation stones. She found it in the early morning light, running her hand along the base of the wall to check the course alignment, and felt the step where the stones had moved. She stood back and looked at the section for a long time without touching it. The frost had not attacked the wall from above. It had gone in underneath, working its way into the soil beneath the stones and expanding when the temperature dropped and the stones had risen with it the same way a door swells in wet weather and no longer fits its frame. She pulled the section apart stone by stone before Edmund had finished breakfast. Laid the blocks in the frost beside the trench she opened beneath the original foundation line. She dug deeper than the original bed, past the first layer of frozen soil, and into the gravel shelf below it. The gravel drained well enough that ice could not build pressure beneath it the way it had under packed earth. She relaid the foundation stones on a bed of tamped gravel and broken rock, testing each block before she set the next course above it. Edmund helped her reset the upper courses before afternoon. He asked no questions about what had failed or why she had chosen this particular solution. He understood enough about his wife's working method to know that the explanation would come when she was ready to give it, which was usually after she had confirmed the fix was working and not before. Nell stood at the edge of the work area most of that morning, her ears turning slowly to track the sound of each stone being set, the way animals track purposeful work, not with anxiety, but with the steady attention of a creature that has learned to read, whether the people around it know what they are doing. The second problem arrived 10 days after the first. A crosswind storm came through the basin from the northwest at an angle Evelyn had not recorded in her 2 winters of observation because it had not appeared in those 2 winters. It was not the worst wind she had seen in Red Hollow. It was unusual in its direction, arriving 30 degrees further west than the prevailing pattern, and it found the open southeast entrance of the enclosure like a hand finding an unlocked door. By morning, a snowdrift 4 feet high had settled exactly where Evelyn had planned to build the first growing frames. She stood at the entrance to the enclosure and looked at the drift without speaking. Cecilia came to stand beside her. Neither woman spoke for a while. The drift was not a structural failure. The wall was intact, the foundation sound the upper courses holding without movement. The drift was something different. It was the terrain correcting an assumption she had made about how the wind would behave at the entrance of the horseshoe. She had assumed the curve of the arms would break the incoming flow before it could penetrate deeply enough to settle snow at the frame positions. She had based that assumption on the boulder on the slope and what she had watched the cloth strips do in the wind that July afternoon. The boulder was a solid, irregular mass that reached several feet above grade. The walls of the enclosure were a designed curve with a wide open entrance, and at certain wind angles, the opening was more invitation than barrier. Evelyn walked the outer curve twice, pressing her palm against the stone at intervals thinking. Then she went to the cliff face and collected a double handful of loose flat stones from the debris field at its base. She carried them back to the eastern arm of the enclosure entrance and began setting them in a short, irregular row along the outer face of the wall. Not straight, angled slightly, projecting outward from the main curve at uneven intervals. Cecilia watched her. Evelyn said nothing yet. She was still testing the idea against the evidence as she worked. The projecting stones would interrupt the clean line of the wall surface where the wind arrived. A smooth curve gave the air a path to follow. An interrupted surface gave it nothing to run along and forced it to slow and break apart before it could gather enough force to push through the opening. She had watched this principle work on rock formations along the survey routes in Nebraska, frost-split cliff faces where irregular surfaces broke winter winds into smaller, weaker currents. She had written it down at the time without knowing what she would eventually use it for. When she had set 12 of the projection stones in place, she walked to the entrance and stood in it. The air inside was not still, but it was slower than the open basin around her. She spent 3 more mornings adding irregular stone projections along both arms of the outer wall, varying the angle and spacing by feel walking in and out of the entrance after each addition to test the change. By the end of the 4th morning, she had no name for what she had built. She described them in the ledger as interruption stones, then crossed that out, then wrote the word Cecilia used when she finally acknowledged them: wind teeth. The teeth of the outer curve that took the edge off what was coming before it arrived. The third problem was the most instructive. In the 3rd week of November, 3 nights after the wind, teeth were complete. A sustained cold snap lowered the temperature in Red Hollow to 17 below zero and kept it there for 36 hours. The gravel heat beds Evelyn had assembled along the interior of the curve had been performing adequately in the weeks before, holding residual warmth through the evening hours and releasing it slowly through the night at a rate the thermometers confirmed. On the first night of the cold snap, they performed as expected. On the second night, the shifting wind stripped heat away from the gravel surface faster than the stones could replace it. And by the early morning hours, the beds were reading only 2 degrees above the open basin floor outside the wall. Evelyn sat in the enclosure before dawn with a lantern and the thermometers and the ledger, and she went through what she knew about why the heat had vanished faster than the stones should have allowed. The gravel absorbed and released heat through the process of the stones, changing temperature at a rate determined by their mass and composition. In stable air, the stones could release their stored warmth steadily over several hours. In moving air, the heat was stripped from the surface of the stones, the way water is stripped from wet laundry in wind. She had factored this into the original design by positioning the heat beds in the sheltered interior of the curve. But the sheltered interior had its own airflow on cold nights, warm air rising and cold air settling in small currents moving along the ground surface. When the external temperature dropped far enough and fast enough, those internal currents accelerated and the heat beds lost their advantage. What she needed was a way to slow the air at ground level inside the enclosure near the heat beds without blocking the flow of slightly warmer air that settled from above during the early evening hours. She looked at the gravel beds for a long time in the lantern light. Then she looked at the wall behind them. She had cut the low vent gaps along the base of the inner wall to relieve the pressure that built up when wind pushed against the stone and needed somewhere to go. The gaps were doing their job. She had not thought about what happened on the floor of the enclosure between the base of the wall and the outer edge of the gravel beds, a strip of open ground that allowed air to move freely along the surface without obstruction. She spent the following morning laying flat stones along the outer edge of each gravel bed, not high enough to block the view from above, just high enough to interrupt the surface airflow at ground level. A low border, 3 inches high at most. She worked without explaining it to Edmund, who helped her carry and set the stones and did not ask. That evening, the temperature dropped again, and she checked the beds at midnight. The heat loss had slowed by more than half. She wrote that down, and then she wrote the reason she believed it had worked, and then she wrote the things she had learned about how winter moved through the enclosure that she had not understood before she built it, and before it failed twice in 3 weeks. The cold did not attack from above. It moved along the ground. It found its way through the gaps at the base, along the floor, along every uninterrupted surface it could reach. What you defended from above, it went around. What you sealed at the bottom, it could not undercut. She thought about that for a while. Then she wrote the note that stayed with her longer than any other entry she would make that season. Winter is not a force that comes down from the sky. It comes up from the ground and in along the floor. You defend the ceiling and neglect the foundation, and the cold wins without effort. Cecilia read that entry the following morning while Evelyn was outside. She set the ledger down without saying anything about it. But Evelyn saw when she came back inside that the older woman had set her own coffee cup down on that particular page, leaving a faint ring in the margin beside the line, a mark the way you mark a passage in a book you expect to return to. It was Nora Wells who broke the silence at the smithy. Evelyn had gone to Jasper Wells in the first week of December with tool designs she needed made from iron. She spread the sketches across his workbench in the dim, warm air of the shop, where the forge fire rolled slow heat through the wooden space in amber waves. The tools she needed were not standard farming instruments. She wanted narrow trench blades for drainage cuts beneath gravel beds, designed narrow enough to work in the confined space between the wall base and the growing frame supports. She wanted shallow heat hose, flat-headed, with short handles for turning the surface of the warm soil, without breaking deeper into the cold layer beneath. She wanted curved scraper plates for shaping the narrow channels she was cutting between the interior wall, face, and the heat beds where she needed precise angles to direct airflow. Jasper studied the sketches with his hands behind his back, his expression carrying the particular combination of professional interest and personal skepticism that belonged to craftsmen who respected well-made designs, regardless of their opinion of the people requesting them. He was a careful man. He turned the sketches twice without speaking. He looked at the profile dimensions of the narrow trench blade for a long time. Most men in Red Hollow believed Evelyn Calloway had lost practical reason, somewhere between the cliff and the notebooks. Jasper had not declared himself on this question publicly, but standing in his smithy, looking at the tool designs, he was visibly calculating something that was not quite agreement. From behind the door to the back room came a sound he knew. A cough, dry and persistent, the kind that had settled into his wife's chest in October and had not found its way out again. Nora Wells stepped into the doorway holding a blanket around her shoulders, her face pale and thin, from weeks of the cough and the cold, and the long winter diet of preserved meat and dried beans, and nothing living. She looked at the sketches on the workbench for a moment. Then she looked at Evelyn. She said it quietly. She said she would trade near anything for something green in February. The smithy went silent after that, in the particular way silence falls in small rooms when a plain truth has been spoken aloud without apology. Jasper set one of the sketches down and picked up another. He studied the curved scraper plate profile without speaking. Then he nodded once, a small, definitive motion that had nothing theatrical in it. He told Evelyn he would make the tools. He told her the price was a portion of the first winter harvest. She agreed without hesitation. They shook hands across the workbench. Outside the open smithy doors, Garrett Dunn's voice carried across the street, telling someone that Evelyn Calloway aimed to feed her household gravel and canyon stone. A few men laughed. Inside the smithy, Jasper lifted his hammer and brought it down on the anvil, and the ring of iron on iron was clean and decisive and considerably louder than the laughter outside. Old Vera Marsh came to the enclosure on a morning when the snow was falling in long, slow, sideways curtains across the basin, the kind of light snowfall that looked almost gentle from a window, but cut through a coat in less than 5 minutes. She appeared at the stone gate without announcement. A small and very old woman in a coat that had been good quality 30 years earlier and had survived to its present condition through the application of patches and stubbornness in roughly equal measure. She had spent years moving between abandoned mining camps north of the Montana Territory line, trading weather knowledge and herbal remedies and seeds adapted to extreme conditions for the supplies she needed to keep moving. Some people in Red Hollow called her eccentric. Others called her unsettling. A few of the older settlers called her valuable quietly, and only to people they trusted, because her predictions about early freezes and late thaws had occasionally been the difference between adequate preparation and genuine crisis. She stood outside the gate for several minutes before Evelyn noticed her. She did not call out or knock. She stood in the light snowfall, looking at the enclosure, with the steady, unhurried attention of someone reading a long document they expected to have opinions about. Her eyes moved across the horseshoe curve of the walls, the wind teeth along the outer face, the position of the growing frame supports visible through the entrance, the narrow channel where water still moved in a thin line beneath its protective stone cap at the base of the cliff. When Evelyn reached the gate, Vera did not say good morning or offer an explanation for her presence. She said the first thing she had to say, which was this: "You are bending winter instead of fighting it." It was the first time anyone outside the three of them had looked at the enclosure and seen immediately and accurately what it was for. Evelyn opened the gate without speaking. Vera came inside and spent another long time walking the interior. She pressed her palm against the gravel heat beds. She crouched at the base of the inner wall and looked at the low border stones with an expression of slight surprise, as if she recognized the principle. She stood at the position where the southeast light would enter during the short December afternoons and looked up at the angle of the cliff face above. Then she reached inside her coat and produced a small bundle of cloth packets tied with faded cord. She held them without extending them toward Evelyn. There were 4 of them, each about the size of a fist. These were seeds. Miner's lettuce adapted over several generations to shallow, rocky soil and low temperatures in the mining camp gardens farther north, where the growing conditions were worse than Red Hollow by a considerable margin. Frost beans, cold hardy, beyond what any standard variety would tolerate. A strain of bitter mustard that miners had grown beside heated stone foundations in abandoned silverworks. Plants that had been selected through years of deliberate cultivation for survival against every reasonable expectation. But she did not hand them over yet. She said she would tell Evelyn something first. She had been at a silver camp north of the territory line several years earlier, a place already nearly abandoned when she arrived, working her way through the remaining structures before the winter sealed the roads. There had been one old man still there. He had been a miner all his life, and his father had been a miner, and his father's father before that. Back to a time when the family had lived in a place far across the ocean that Vera could not locate on any map she had ever seen. A place where they had gone into the earth for tin and copper, for generations along a coastline she could only picture from his descriptions, cold and rocky and surrounded by sea. His grandfather's grandfather had learned a particular method of building. Curved stone walls constructed around the entrance to mine shafts to redirect the wind that came across the open hillside and funneled cold air straight down into the working levels below. The walls were not built to block the wind. Nothing built against that wind on those hillsides blocked it. The walls were built to split it, to divide the incoming current into 2 quieter streams that curved around the enclosure and rejoined below the shaft entrance without the force they had carried when they arrived. The miners could work near the shaft openings through the winter without the wind killing them by degrees. The stone walls held enough residual warmth from the daylight hours to keep the temperature at the shaft entrance measurably above the open hillside air. The old man at the camp had learned it from his father, who had learned it from his father, who had learned it from his. No one had ever written it down. No document existed. No diagram had been made. The knowledge lived entirely in the chain of men who had passed it, from hand to hand in the dark at the end of a long shift, one generation teaching the next, the way all knowledge lived before anyone thought to give it a permanent address. The old miner had told Vera the one thing his father had always said about it, the sentence that passed with the knowledge through every generation. Stone remembers warmth, the way the old remember kindness, longer than anyone expects. Then he had asked Vera nothing about where she was going or what she planned to do with what he had told her. He had simply told her because she was there, and because she asked, and because knowledge that is not passed on eventually disappears along with the last person holding it. Vera looked at Evelyn for a moment after she finished. She said her condition was this. The seeds she had brought were adapted and valuable and would not survive everything Red Hollow could throw at them, but they would survive more than anything else Evelyn was likely to find in the basin before March. She would give them only if Evelyn agreed to write down everything, not only the successes, the failures, the reasons for each failure, the adjustments that followed, the temperature readings before and after every change, the complete record of what worked and what did not, and why she believed the difference mattered. She held Evelyn's eyes while she said this last part. Knowledge dies faster than men out here. It was the truest thing anyone had said to Evelyn since she arrived in Red Hollow Basin. She took the seeds. That night, she opened the ledger to a fresh section and began writing differently than she had written before. The previous entries were records. Temperature at dawn, wind direction at sunset, frost depth at 3 locations, numbers and observations accurate and precise, and as close to complete as she could make them. What she had not written was why. Why the muslin frame had failed in the wet freeze 2 seasons earlier. Not the mechanism of the failure which she had recorded, but the assumption underlying the design that had allowed the failure to happen. Why the first gravel heat bed position had been wrong. Not the result, but the reasoning that had preceded the result, and the flaw in that reasoning that she could now identify in retrospect. She wrote for 3 hours. Edmund had gone to bed. Cecilia sat at the other end of the table with her own cup and her silence, in the unhurried company of a woman who understood that this kind of writing required proximity and quiet and nothing more. Outside the cabin windows, the first hard cold of December pressed against the glass and made the lamp flame lean slightly, despite the closed door. Inside the ledger, on pages that had been empty for 2 years, understanding had begun. The water revealed itself in the most reluctant way possible. Evelyn had been watching a narrow strip along the base of the cliff face for 10 days. A section perhaps 8 feet long where the snow cover was consistently thinner than the surrounding ground. Not bare, not dramatically different. Just enough thinner that if you were watching for it, specifically watching for the places where the normal rules of the basin floor did not quite apply, you noticed it. Evelyn had been watching for exactly that kind of irregularity for the better part of 3 years, and she noticed it on a morning in the second week of December when the light was flat and gray, and the observation required deliberate attention. She did not tell Cecilia or Edmund what she was looking for when she began digging. She knew what she was looking for. She could not confirm it until she found it, and she had been wrong in her readings of this terrain before, and she was not interested in conducting this particular investigation with an audience. She dug for 3 days. The first day produced frozen shale and damp stone, and nothing more. The second day extended the trench 6 inches deeper and 6 feet longer along the cliff base and produced the same result. On the third day, Cecilia came to where she was working in the mid-morning cold and stood at the edge of the trench and looked at the exposed layers for a moment. She said one word: too high. Evelyn stopped digging and looked at the exposed section. She had been working through the soil layer and into the shale shelf. Cecilia was looking at the underside of the shale, the dark surface of the rock below the layer Evelyn had been removing. There was a change in color there that Evelyn had not looked at carefully enough. A darker staining along the lower edge of the shale that suggested moisture had been moving at a level below the shelf, rather than through the soil above it. Evelyn put her shovel against the underside of the shale shelf instead of through the earth above it. She hit water in the following hour. Not much water. A seep, barely more than a slow darkening of the stone face, a thin thread of moisture moving through a crack in the rock at a rate that was by any ordinary measure completely insufficient. But it was moving. In the middle of a Montana December, at the base of a cliff that had been frozen solid for 6 weeks, water was moving, which meant it had not frozen, which meant it was emerging from a depth where the ground temperature remained above freezing, regardless of what happened on the surface. Moving water in winter was worth considerably more than still water in summer. Evelyn built carefully. She cut a narrow trench lined with flat stones to carry the seep away from the cliff face in a controlled direction. She built a shallow holding basin from fitted sandstone pieces, small enough to fill quickly and allow the overflow to continue moving through the system. She cut an overflow channel to relieve pressure during cold snaps, when ice might otherwise form and block the flow entirely. Nell carried the flat stone pieces in paired canvas sacks slung across her back, moving from the debris field at the cliff base to the channel site, in a steady, unhurried back and forth that covered the 100 yards between them without complaint. By the end of 3 days, the old mule had transported more stone than 2 men could have managed with hand barrows, and she had done it without a single wasted step. The system held for 11 days. Then a brutal overnight freeze came through Red Hollow, faster and colder than the 2-day warning period Evelyn had estimated, and the expanding ice split a clay-sealed joint near the basin edge and pushed water backward through the channel and under the gravel beds along the enclosure floor. She found it at dawn. The channel cracked at the joint, the basin partly drained in the wrong direction, the gravel beds wet in places they should not have been. She stood over it with both hands at her sides. Cecilia came and crouched beside the broken section. She pressed loose gravel into the base along the channel edge, testing the ground beneath it, feeling how the freeze had moved through the soil. She said it simply and without particular emphasis. Hard clay breaks. Flexible seams move. Evelyn thought about that for a moment. Then she understood what it meant in practice. Clay packed tight against a stone joint created a rigid seal. When the temperature dropped fast enough, the clay and the stone shrank at slightly different rates and the joint failed at the boundary between them. A flexible seal. Gravel beneath the water path, rather than packed clay, could shift slightly under freeze pressure without fracturing, because it had nowhere to hold to and nothing to break from. They rebuilt the channel over 3 days. Softer clay at the joints, not packed hard, but pressed in loosely, leaving it compressible. Gravel beds beneath the water path to allow micro-movement without rupture. The overflow channel was widened to give the water more room to move fast enough that it could not pause long enough to freeze. On the 5th morning after the repair, the temperature dropped to 19 below zero at dawn. The water still moved. It was a thin silver thread, barely wider than a writing quill, running through the channel and into the small basin, in a silence that was almost indistinguishable from the general silence of the frozen basin around them. But it was there, and it was moving, and the basin showed no signs of cracking or pressure. Edmund knelt beside it in the morning cold. He looked at the thin line of moving water for a long time without saying anything. His breath moved in slow, white shapes through the air above it. Evelyn stood behind him and did not speak either. There was nothing useful that words would have added to that moment. The cold came in the first week of January with a force that changed the character of the difficulty entirely. It was not the worst cold Evelyn had tracked in 3 winters at Red Hollow Basin, but it was the most sustained. The temperature dropped to 24 below zero on the night of the 4th and did not rise above 15, below for the following 6 days. The wind shifted out of the northwest on the 2nd night and pushed snow against the southeastern opening of the enclosure in a sustained drift that narrowed the light exposure hour by hour as the days progressed. 2 of the growing frames lost their muslin coverings to the wind, the cloth freezing stiff before Evelyn could get to them. The bitter mustard seedlings that had been showing their first true leaves collapsed beneath the ice into flat, dark rows that pressed themselves against the cold soil as if trying to disappear into it. The miner's lettuce held for 3 days. Then 2 of those frames failed as well, the gravel beneath them losing heat faster than the stone could replace it. The micro-temperature advantage the enclosure had been providing for 6 weeks, vanishing in a single overnight drop. On the 5th evening of the cold snap, Evelyn sat in the cabin beside the stove and said nothing for a long time. The fire was smaller than usual. They had been managing the wood supply carefully, and the cold outside demanded more heat than the cabin had been designed to provide. The lamp burned low on the table. Edmund sat across from her. He was not looking at her, not reading, not engaged in any particular task. He was simply present in the room, which was the most useful thing he could offer, and he knew it. She thought about Harlan Shaw's papers on the table in September, the 1st of March, the number in the account column. She thought about the conversation she would have to have in the spring if the enclosure failed, and what she would say, and whether there was anything to say that would make the failure mean something other than what it meant. She sat with all of that, without speaking it aloud. Across the cabin, in the other room, Cecilia had gone to bed early. She was not sleeping. In the darkness beyond the doorway, her voice came low and steady, into the room not directed at anyone, not expecting a response. She was reciting, planting depths for the miner's lettuce, the numbers from the October trials, heat retention, averages from the gravel beds at midnight across 7 different nights, the temperature differential at the southeast entrance in the first week of December versus the second, the timing on the drainage channel adjustments and what the subsequent readings had shown, germination dates, frost threshold estimates, seed viability in shallow rocky soil at extended low temperatures. She recited all of it from memory, quietly and completely, the way people recite things in the dark when they need to confirm they still hold them. The structure was still there even when the cold said it was not. Evelyn listened to Cecilia's voice in the other room for a long time without moving. Before the sky had fully lightened, the next morning, she rose alone and put on her heaviest coat and her gloves and the scarf she had not needed since February of the previous year, and she went out alone across the frozen ground toward the enclosure while the rest of the cabin slept. She did not prepare herself for what she would find. She had found enough things in the basin over 3 years to understand that preparation for a particular outcome was a form of self-deception that wasted the energy she needed for whatever the actual outcome required. The first frame was gone, not damaged. The supports had collapsed in the night and the muslin lay flat against the frozen ground beneath a crust of ice. The seedlings under it were beyond recovery. The second frame had frozen solid, the cloth itself transformed into something resembling thin white ceramic. When she pressed her thumb against it, the surface did not flex. The plants inside had died under a sealed layer of ice that had formed between the cloth and the growing medium. The third frame had been pushed inward by the weight of snow accumulating against the outer wall. The supports had bowed, and the whole structure had settled sideways against the interior wall, face and what had been inside it was somewhere underneath. She stood between the third and fourth frames. She breathed slowly. She walked to the fourth frame. It was positioned closest to the cliff, at the lowest point of the interior curve, where the wall was thickest and where the sandstone face above it had been absorbing and releasing heat through the daylight hours since the wall was first complete. The muslin on this frame was crusted with frost on its outer surface. The support poles had held. She could see by the way the cloth sat that the interior space had not collapsed. She lifted the edge of the frosted muslin with hands that were shaking slightly from the cold, and she pulled it aside and she lowered herself until she was looking at the growing medium inside from a position very close to the ground. One plant, a single miner's lettuce seedling, small enough to sit in the cup of a palm, pale green in the gray early morning light, standing upright on a stem no thicker than a thread of wool. It was alive. Not robust, not confident, barely measurably alive, but upright and unbroken in the frozen interior of the last remaining frame in the middle of a Montana January. She had brought the thermometer. She put it inside the frame and waited with her knees in the snow while the reading settled. 21 below zero inside the enclosure at this position. She took the second thermometer from her coat pocket and held it in the open air beyond the wall. 22 below zero in the open basin. 1 degree. The entire margin that had preserved the only living plant in the enclosure on this morning was 1 degree. A margin that appeared on no instrument with the drama it deserved, a margin that would have been invisible to anyone not looking for it, with the kind of attention Evelyn had been applying to this piece of land for 3 years. She stayed on her knees in the snow and looked at the seedling for a long time. The wind was moving across the open basin, beyond the wall, with a sound like something being pulled taut and then released. Inside the enclosure, the air was not still, but it was slower. The gravel beneath her knees had not given up entirely. The cliff above her was gathering what the coming day would offer, and preparing to give it back steadily and without announcement in the hours after the sun had moved on. 1 degree was not a triumph. 1 degree was barely a fact. But it was the fact she had, and it was the fact she had built, and it was still standing. 1 degree became 2. 2 became 4, not quickly, and not without reversals, and not in the manner of a story that has decided to be generous with the people living inside it. The recovery of the Red Hollow enclosure in the final weeks of January 1884 was the kind of recovery that tested patience more than competence, because the work had already been done, and what remained was only the waiting and waiting in a Montana winter, with the account balance running toward its limit, required a quality of nerve that had nothing to do with intelligence or skill. Evelyn Calloway had that quality. She had come by it the slow way, which is the only way it can be come by. She repaired the 3 failed frames in the days following the cold snap. She worked without haste and without the urgency that comes from panic, which is a different thing from the urgency that comes from necessity, and she had long since learned to tell them apart. The support poles for the 2 collapsed frames were reset in the gravel, with stones packed tight around the base. New muslin was cut from the spare length she had stored in the cabin against exactly this possibility. She coated the replacement cloth with a second application of boiled linseed oil and let it cure against the inner wall face for 2 days before she used it, because the first application had been done in autumn and the oil had stiffened in the cold and lost some of its sealing capacity. The surviving lettuce seedling in the 4th frame she did not disturb at all. She checked it morning and evening, lifting the muslin edge carefully and replacing it with the same careful motion, taking the temperature reading, recording the number. On the 3rd day, it had produced a new leaf, small and pale, and so tentative, it was almost an apology for existing. On the 5th day, the new leaf had straightened and darkened slightly, and stopped apologizing. She wrote that down, not the measurement, the observation. The bitter mustard she had believed entirely lost showed green at the soil surface on the 8th day after the cold snap ended. Not all of it. 2 of the 4 rows. The outer leaves had been destroyed by the freeze lying black and flat against the medium, but the root crowns had survived beneath the surface, and the new growth coming from them was low and compact and tougher than the first growth had been, the way plants sometimes come back from cold damage, with a constitution shaped by what they survived. Cecilia looked at the returning mustard one morning, without speaking for a while. Then she said that cold-killed plants sometimes came back harder than they started, that the damage pruned what was weak and left only what the plant had decided was worth defending. She said her husband's grandmother in Iowa had said the same thing about people, and she had thought about whether it was true for people for 50 years without reaching a conclusion. Evelyn did not respond to that. She was recording the soil temperature beneath the recovered mustard rows. But she wrote the observation down that evening. By the last week of January, the enclosure had stopped looking like an argument. Evelyn was making to a skeptical audience and started looking like something that was simply, quietly, plainly alive. The miner's lettuce had spread low across the warmest sections of the gravel beds, the rosettes of round leaves covering the dark stone surface in a pale green mat that was visible from the enclosure entrance on a clear morning. The mustard was thickening in its 2 surviving rows, the new leaves shorter and darker than the ones the cold had taken. The frost beans had not given up entirely, and along the section of wall that received the longest afternoon light through the southeast opening, 3 of them had climbed weakly up the narrow pole, supports Evelyn had set, reaching with a persistence that seemed disproportionate to their size. She harvested for the first time on the 23rd of January. She did not take much. She worked with a small knife along the outer leaves of the lettuce, only taking what the plant could give without weakening the roots beneath. She cut the outermost leaves of the mustard rose in the same manner, and she cut them low below the growth point so the plant would continue rather than stall. What she collected fit in the bottom third of a shallow basket. Not abundance, not the conclusion of something. A fact. A green and living fact on the 23rd of January in Red Hollow Basin, Montana, in a winter that had not finished trying to end them. She brought the basket inside and set it on the kitchen table. The 3 of them stood around it without speaking for a moment, standing around something they had been working toward long enough that seeing it finally present in the room required a different kind of adjustment than they anticipated. Edmund picked up a mustard leaf and held it for a moment. Then he ate it slowly. The bitterness was strong. The cold had concentrated it, the way cold concentrates most flavors, and the leaf was sharp and alive on the tongue, in a way that salt pork and dried beans and cornmeal mush were not and could not be. It tasted like something that had been growing. It tasted like something that would keep growing. He did not say anything about it. Neither did Cecilia. Neither did Evelyn. They finished what was in the basket between them, standing at the kitchen table in the last light of a January afternoon, without plates and without ceremony, and the only sound in the cabin was the wind pressing against the north wall and the faint shift of wood settling in the stove. 2 days later, Evelyn carried a small wrapped bundle of mustard greens to the smithy. Jasper Wells was working. When she arrived, his hammer moving in the steady rhythm of a man engaged in a task he understood completely. He set the hammer down when she came through the door and looked at the bundle in her hands with an expression she could not entirely read. She set it on the edge of the workbench near the forge where the heat from the coals would keep the leaves from stiffening in the cold air. Nora Wells came from the back room. She was moving more carefully than she had been in December. The cough had settled deeper through the winter, the way these things do when the cold does not relent, and the body has no fresh nutrition to draw on for the long work of recovery. Her face was thinner. The blanket around her shoulders was the heavy one, now not the lighter one she had been wearing in December. She unwrapped the bundle slowly and stood looking at the mustard leaves for a moment before she touched them. Then she took a single leaf and ate it standing near the forge in the warmth that radiated from the coals while Jasper watched and Evelyn watched and nobody spoke. The color came back to Nora's face before she had finished the leaf. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in a story that has decided to be easy. A slow return, the way circulation returns to cold fingers held near a fire or starting at some interior point, and moving outward until the face looking back at you looks less like it belongs to someone very far away, and more like it belongs to the person you remembered. Jasper watched his wife's face for that entire time. He did not say anything when the color came back. He looked at Evelyn, and the look between them covered the entire agreement they had made at the workbench in December, and confirmed it without requiring any further words. The news moved through Red Hollow by evening, not as an announcement, as a fact that people passed from one conversation to another, the way facts move through small communities where everyone knows everyone's business and the interesting news travels faster than the mail. Fresh green food in January in Montana was not a category that existed in most people's understanding of what was possible in this basin. The information required some adjustment before it could be properly received. Garrett Dunn received it standing near the general store stove the following morning, when Evelyn brought several bunches of mustard greens in to trade for flour and lamp oil. He stood at a distance, and watched the transaction with the expression of a man watching something happen that he had publicly said would not happen, and who had not yet worked out what to do with that information. He did not laugh. He watched the storekeeper examine the mustard leaves with the focused attention of a man trying to understand what he was looking at, and he watched one of the other men in the store take a piece of leaf and put it in his mouth, and he watched the room go quiet when the crunch of fresh stem carried in the cold air, the way only a living plant can crunch. He stood there. He did not say anything. The absence of Garrett Dunn's voice in that room was a different kind of sound, the way silence in a place that has been reliably loud becomes its own statement. Several people noticed it. Nobody commented on it. But it was there, and it was real, and it was the first crack in something that had been solid for 3 years. Pastor Owen Cutter delivered his sermon that Sunday morning and addressed the matter from the only angle he had left, which was the spiritual one. He spoke about the danger of assigning too much significance to material outcomes, about the way that one successful winter did not constitute a philosophy about the distinction between providence providing and human cleverness, claiming credit for what providence had arranged. He said these things with the same careful warmth he always brought to corrections he delivered, as kindnesses and the congregation received them with the nod they gave to things they had heard before, but were not entirely sure they still believed. Several members of that congregation had already tasted the mustard leaves. The words did not land the same way they had landed in previous sermons. The blizzard arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days after Evelyn had noticed the pressure drop. She had been watching the signs for 48 hours before the storm came. The wind direction had shifted twice in the course of a single afternoon. The air had developed the particular still quality that precedes large storms in Montana, a silence that is not peaceful but preparatory, as if the atmosphere is collecting itself before a significant expenditure. The snowbirds had left the fence lines on Monday morning in a sudden, unanimous departure that she had seen before under similar conditions. She spent Monday afternoon harvesting everything in the enclosure that had reached a harvestable state. She worked steadily and without rushing, taking the outer leaves of the lettuce in long passes along each row, cutting the mustard down to the regrowth point, collecting the frost beans that had developed to the point where they could be eaten green. She filled 2 baskets and brought them inside and wrapped them in damp cloth in the cold storage section of the cabin, where the temperature would keep them without freezing them solid. She went back out and walked the enclosure wall, checking each joint and each foundation course, and each section of the overflow channel from the water, seat-pressing the stones with her hands, testing for movement or instability. She checked the drainage trenches beneath the gravel beds. She checked the muslin covers on the frames, pulling each one taut and securing the edges with the extra stones she had kept near the wall for exactly this purpose. Then she went inside and helped Edmund bring in extra wood from the stack against the east cabin wall, enough for 4 days if they were careful. The storm hit after midnight. It came in from the northwest with the kind of force that reorganizes everything. It touches the kind of storm that does not negotiate with the structures it encounters, but simply establishes what they are actually made of. Fence posts disappeared beneath drifting snow before the first hour was finished. The sound of the wind against the cabin walls was not a single sound, but a shifting variable pressure that changed pitch as the gusts found different angles against the timber. Evelyn rose at 2 a.m. and dressed fully and went out. The lantern she carried was nearly useless in the wind. The flame survived inside the glass, but provided almost no illumination against the white wall of moving snow. She navigated from the cabin to the enclosure by memory, and by the feel of the ground under her boots, the slight depression of the path she had walked 600 times, the change in the ground surface, where the cleared area ended and the frost-hardened slope began. She found the enclosure wall by touch. She moved along it with one hand against the stone, feeling for the joints and the courses and the stability of each section she passed. The water channel had slowed, not stopped. Slowed. Ice was forming along the edges of the channel in the lower section, narrowing the path the water had to move through, and if it narrowed further, it would close entirely, and the pressure from above would have nowhere to go. And the clay joints she had rebuilt with flexibility in mind would face the kind of test she had hoped to postpone until she had more data. She went back to the cabin for the trench tools. Edmund was awake when she came back inside. He was already dressed. He had heard her go out, and he had waited the length of time it took him to conclude that she was not coming back immediately, and then he had gotten up and put his coat on. They went out together. She worked at the ice forming along the channel edges, with the narrow blade breaking it back from the sides, carefully creating enough clearance that the water could continue moving at the rate it needed to move to keep the system from freezing solid. Edmund held the lantern close to the work and cleared loose snow from the channel path with the flat of his hand. The wind made the work difficult, not by making it impossible, but by adding a constant, irrelevant demand on attention that could only be ignored and not resolved. The water was still moving when she had finished. Barely, but enough. They came back inside at 3 a.m. Evelyn's coat was crusted with driven snow on the front, and her gloves had frozen stiff enough that she had to flex her hands inside them to keep the circulation adequate. Edmund made coffee on the stove without speaking, and they sat at the table while the storm pressed against the walls and the coffee was hot and the stove was warm and the water in the channel outside was still moving, and those things together were a version of enough. Cecilia was awake in the other room. She said nothing. She did not need to. The first knock came the following afternoon. The storm was in its second day, and the wind had not relented. Evelyn heard the knock at the gate rather than the cabin door, which meant someone had come to the enclosure directly, which meant the person knew where to find what they were looking for. She went out and found Nora Wells standing at the stone gate, wrapped in Jasper's coat over her own, a scarf covering everything except her eyes. She had walked from the smithy in the blizzard. She stood at the gate with a particular expression that Evelyn recognized as the expression of a woman who has set aside her pride far enough to come and ask for something she could not provide for herself. The remaining greens from the pre-storm harvest were inside. Evelyn brought what she could spare without taking the portion she had set aside for what she had already guessed was still coming. The second knock came that evening. She was at the enclosure gate again before she recognized who it was, because Garrett Dunn, in a blizzard, with snow frozen across his beard and his coat pulled up to his ears, was a different version of Garrett Dunn than the one who stood outside the saloon on Friday afternoons, with his opinions arranged and ready. He was smaller, not physically, but the thing that made him large in town, the certainty, the readiness of his voice, was not present in the same way. What was present was a man who needed something. His certainty had not been able to provide. His youngest daughter had been without fresh food for 6 weeks. He had seen the signs for 3 days before he was willing to name them, and he had named them that morning, and the naming had brought him to this gate in the middle of this storm. He could not look at her directly when he spoke. He addressed his words to a point somewhere past her shoulder, the way people address words when the words cost more than they expected. She did not make him meet her eyes. She brought him what she had kept back, like the mustard bunches wrapped in damp cloth, the remaining frost bean pods, the last of the lettuce from the basket. He took them with both hands and held them carefully, the way a person holds something that matters, and he said something low, that was probably thank you. Though the wind pulled the words apart before they reached her clearly, he turned and walked back into the storm. She watched him go until the white air took him entirely. The last knock came at a late hour. She had stopped trying to track precisely. The storm was at its worst. the wind driving horizontally across the basin, with a sound like something being torn. She had checked the water channel twice more during the day, and it was holding. The enclosure wall had not moved. The surviving frames had not collapsed. She heard the knock at the gate, and she put on her coat and went out again. Owen Cutter stood outside the stone wall. He was a man who occupied space, with the natural confidence of someone whose role in a community has been long established and consistently reinforced. He was accustomed to being the person others came to. He was not accustomed to standing on the other side of anyone's gate in the middle of the night in a blizzard, and the unfamiliarity of that position showed in the way he stood. Not the customary way, but the way of a man who has made a specific decision to be somewhere, and is still working out how to occupy the ground he has chosen. His son had a fever. He said it plainly. Not the son's age, or the duration, or what had been tried. Just the fact, and the fact of where he was standing, which said everything the words left out. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. She thought about the Sunday morning in November of 1882, when she had sat in the back of the church building and heard him speak about the spiritual danger of mistaking stubbornness for wisdom, and she had sat still through the entire sermon without changing her expression because she was a woman who had learned to hold things in the part of herself where they could be examined without being acted upon immediately. She had held that sermon there for more than a year. She looked at Owen Cutter standing at her gate, in the worst storm of the winter, his face older than she remembered it from any Sunday service. The certainty he carried inside the church building entirely absent from his face in the cold outside it. She went inside and she brought him everything she had kept back, the full portion she had reserved, and the additional portion she had calculated she could take from the frame plants without breaking the root systems beneath them. He took it from her with both hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the gap between them and carried the sound of the storm in from the open basin. Then he said her name. Just her name. Mrs. Calloway, in a tone that had nothing in it of the pulpit and everything in it of a father standing in a blizzard at the gate of a woman he had publicly questioned asking for help. She had the grace not to make difficult to accept. She said good night. She went back inside. She stood at the window and watched his lantern move across the white basin until it disappeared in the direction of the town, and then she stood there a while longer, even after the light was gone. When the storm passed on the third morning, Red Hollow Basin looked like a world that had been put away. The fences along the road were gone below their top rails. The trails that connected the homesteads and the town had vanished entirely, replaced by a uniform white surface that gave no indication of where the paths had been. The supply wagons from the south routes had not arrived, and no one expected them for another week at minimum. Several cattle had been lost against broken windbreaks, and the general store inventory of preserved food had declined faster than the owners had planned, for which had been a concern before the storm, and was a more pressing concern after it. The enclosure wall had held entirely. Every course of stone was in the position it had been in before the storm. The foundation had not moved. The wind teeth along the outer curve had done their work against the worst the blizzard offered. The water channel was moving slower than before, but moving, and the ice that had formed along the edges during the 2 nights Evelyn had worked to keep the path clear was already retreating in the pale post-storm light. Inside the enclosure, the surviving frames had held. The miner's lettuce was flattened against the growing medium beneath the muslin, pressed down by the cold and the pressure differential that the storm had created inside the enclosure. But when she lifted the muslin carefully and held the back of her hand an inch above the plants, she felt what she had learned to feel for. A faint warmth. Not warmth the way a fire is warm. Warmth the way a living thing is warm. the difference between a temperature and a presence. She let the muslin down gently. She walked the perimeter of the enclosure one full time without stopping, running her hand along the stone as she went, reading it the way she had learned to read it, the way she had been learning to read it since that first April evening when she had pressed her palm against the cliff face, while the rest of the valley went cold, and the stone gave back what the day had given it. Then she climbed to the top of the curved wall at its highest point and stood there. The basin below her was white and still and absolutely quiet after 3 days of sound. She could see across the full length of Red Hollow from this position, from the rocky eastern ridgeline to the low western ground where Garrett Dunn's cattle range ran along the creek bank. She could see the rooftops of the town visible at the southern curve of the basin road, smoke beginning to rise from chimneys as the storm's aftermath settled and people returned to the ordinary work of warming spaces and feeding families. She could see the tracks in the snow. They were visible from the height of the wall with a clarity that ground level would not have provided. The blizzard had covered every existing path and track and left the basin floor as a clean white record of everything that had moved across it since the storm ended. And what had moved across it had moved in one direction from several different starting points across the basin, converging on a single destination. The tracks all led here, not in a formal way, not in a straight line, not in the organized pattern of a community, making a deliberate statement, but the accumulated record of separate people who had each made their own decision to come to this particular gate in the worst storm of the winter, because there was something here that was not anywhere else. The track from the direction of the smithy, the track from the cattle range on the western ground, the track from the direction of the parsonage at the south edge of town, and smaller tracks she had not seen, made other people who had come quietly in the middle of the storm, or in the early hours of the third day, coming for what they had heard was here for whatever amount she could spare for the simple fact of something green and living in January. She stood on top of the wall for a long time. She was not a woman who moved easily towards sentiment, not because she lacked feeling, but because she had learned early that feeling and clarity were both necessary, and that they needed to occupy different compartments of the same mind, each one available when the situation called for it, and neither one permitted to crowd out the other. But she stood there for a long time. She was 66 years old. She had spent 3 winters in Red Hollow Basin, learning how stone remembered heat, and how wind could be divided, and how water moved underground that the surface said was frozen solid. She had filled 4 leather ledgers with the evidence of what was possible in a place everyone around her had agreed was useful only for disappointing people. She had been told from the saloon and the pulpit and the polite distance of neighbors who came to her door carrying bread as a vehicle for doubt that what she was trying to do was not possible. And now in the white quiet, after the worst storm of the winter, the snow held the record of the truth. She climbed down from the wall. She went inside and helped Edmund make breakfast and said nothing about what she had seen from the top of the enclosure. She already knew what she thought about it. She wrote it down that evening instead. Spring came to Red Hollow Basin late and slowly in 1884, the snow releasing its grip in the particular grudging manner of Montana, a little at a time, the ground softening from the surface down by degrees so gradual they were more felt than seen. The basin roads became passable in the final week of March, which was later than any of the older settlers could remember, and the supply wagons from the south routes arrived with mud on their wheels up to the axle hubs, and news that was considerably more concerning than the late roads. The freighters brought word of a seed blight that had moved through the stored grain stocks across most of the region south of Red Hollow during the winter months. The blight had been established in the storage facilities before winter, sealed the supply routes, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, it had worked through the seed stocks that were supposed to supply the spring planting across 3 counties. Several settlements were already rationing what remained of their viable seed, holding back the sound stock from their own food supplies for planting rather than eating, because the arithmetic of a spring with insufficient seed was worse than the arithmetic of a lean winter. The prices for any available viable seed had tripled in the weeks since the news had reached the larger towns, and the price was still moving upward as demand continued to outpace supply. Red Hollow Basin had not been spared. The community meeting at the general store that week had the quality of meetings where the problem is clearly understood and the solutions are not. People spoke plainly about what they had in storage and what they did not. The numbers were not comfortable. Several families on the eastern edge of the basin were in a position that would be serious before the planting season ended, regardless of what prices did. Evelyn attended the meeting and said very little. She went home and opened the ledger to the section where she had been recording her seed-saving notes since the autumn. Miner's lettuce with germination records and viability estimates from 3 separate cold weather trials. Frost bean seed stock collected from the strongest plants at the end of the growing cycle and stored in the temperature-stable section of the enclosure, where the wall maintained a consistent cold above freezing through the winter months. Bitter mustard from the recovered rose seed heads collected before the blizzard and processed in the cabin kitchen on a morning in late December when she had nothing else pressing. She had not saved this seed because she expected a regional blight. She had saved it because old Vera Marsh had told her that knowledge dies faster than men, and because Evelyn had understood that seeds were a form of knowledge, and because a woman who has been writing down the reasons for failures for 3 years has a different relationship with the concept of keeping things than a woman who has not. It was 3 days after the community meeting when Harlan Shaw came to the Calloway homestead. She heard the sound of approach and looked out the north window, expecting to see a horse at the gate. There was no horse. Harlan Shaw was walking across the yard through the mud of the late March thaw, his boots sinking to the ankle, with each step in the softened ground, his coat carrying the marks of a walk taken through spring mud, rather than the kind of approach a man makes when he has come to deliver instructions or collect what is owed. Men rode to Red Hollow Basin when they came with authority. They walked when they came with questions. Evelyn opened the door before he reached it and did not say anything, because the walk across the muddy yard had already said most of what needed to be said about the nature of this visit, and additional words from her would only make it harder for him to say what he had come to say. He came inside and she poured coffee, and he sat at the kitchen table with his hands around the cup, and he looked at the room for a moment before he spoke. He asked about the seed stock, not as a demand and not as a negotiation, as a question from a man who had walked through ankle-deep mud to ask it, which told her everything she needed to know about how he had decided to approach this conversation. She brought the ledger to the table and opened it to the seed-saving sections. She showed him the germination records and the viability estimates and the notes from the cold weather trials. She showed him the storage conditions and the quantities she had recorded in the autumn and the projected quantity available for the coming season. Then she brought him to the enclosure. He stood at the entrance and looked inside. The miner's lettuce was running its second flush of the season lower and more compact than the first growth of January shaped by the cold, into something that looked more deliberate than the earlier growth had. The mustard was returning again from the root crowns, a third cycle of leaves from plants that had now survived 2 hard freezes and emerged from both of them with a constitution the original seeds had not possessed. The frost beans were showing new growth at the climbing tips. Snow still lay in unmelted patches along the outer base of the north wall on the shaded side, where the sun had not yet reached. But inside the enclosure, the ground was clear and the soil was working. Shaw stood at the entrance for a long time. He looked at the curved walls and the gravel beds and the narrow channel where water still moved quietly at the base of the cliff. He looked at the orientation of the southeast opening and the angle of the cliff face above it. He looked at the low border stones along the gravel bed edges and the wind teeth along the outer curve, and the thick spine of the north wall built for the crosswinds. He looked at all of it for a long time. Then he said that he had not answered her question. In September, she had asked him if he had ever stood against that cliff after sunset in January. He had not answered. He said now that he had thought about the question more than once during the winter, and he said it the way a man says something he has been carrying for 6 months and has finally found the right moment to set down. She did not say that she had known he would think about it. She did not say a great many things she could have said. She showed him instead the seed ledger sections again, the detailed records, and she told him what she believed the enclosure could produce through another growing cycle, with modifications she had already planned for the summer. She told him what she thought was possible for other properties in the basin if the method were applied with sufficient attention to local conditions, which would vary from one site to another and would require the same kind of observation she had done over 3 years, which meant it would not be quick and it would not be simple, but it was learnable by anyone willing to pay the kind of attention it demanded. She told him she intended to write all of it down. Not just the successes. The failures, too, and the reasons for them, and the adjustments that followed. A complete record that could be consulted by someone who had not been present for the learning, and who might be facing conditions she had not faced and would need the underlying principles rather than the specific numbers. She said this was what old Vera Marsh had asked of her, and she understood now why Vera had asked it, and she intended to honor the request regardless of what happened with the account balance or the homestead or anything else. Shaw looked at the enclosure for one more long moment. Then he told her that the account would be satisfied through an arrangement he had in mind, the details of which he suggested they discuss when the seed distribution for the spring planting had been organized, because that was the more immediate problem. He put on his coat and picked up his hat and walked back across the muddy yard to the road, and she watched him go. And the thing she noticed most was that he had come on foot, and he left on foot. And the walk in both directions was the same walk through the same mud, taken by the same man who had arrived with papers in his coat 6 months earlier and had not arrived that way today. The change that came to Red Hollow Basin that summer moved in separate decisions made by separate people who had each arrived at the same conclusion by different routes. By midsummer, curved stone walls had begun appearing at the edges of gardens across the valley, behind cabins and beside livestock sheds and along creek banks, all of them. Oriented the same direction, all of them representing a conversation about heat and stone and winter that could not have taken place without the 3 years of work and failure and careful record that preceded it. The Alderman family on the south edge of the basin built the first one in late June, using a different stone than the red sandstone at the cliff, but the same proportions and the same southeast orientation. The family had done what Evelyn had told them was the most important thing, walking the property for 2 full weeks before they built anything, watching how their land held and lost heat through the day and evening, recording what they saw in a composition book they had bought from the general store specifically for the purpose. A second wall appeared in July behind a livestock shed on the Garrett Dunn property. Edmund told her this with the neutral tone he used for information he considered significant, but had decided not to editorialize about. Evelyn recorded it in the ledger that evening without comment. By August, there were 6 additional curved walls visible from different points along the basin road, each one oriented toward the south or southeast, each one representing the same understanding about how warmth moved through land and what a curve of stone placed in the right position against the right terrain could catch and hold through the long months when the winter was continuously trying to take it away. Some of the walls were well built, Some had visible flaws she could identify from the road without stopping. She did not offer corrections to anyone who had not asked for them. If someone came to her with a question, she answered it completely. If they did not come, she left them to the same learning that had cost her 3 winters. What she did was continue to write. The 4th leather ledger had been filled before winter. She had begun a 5th in the spring and was halfway through it by August. Not just her own observations now, but questions people had brought to her from their own enclosures and the answers she had worked out with them, the variations in soil and stone, and wind behavior from one site to another, the principles that appeared to hold across all of them, and the conditions under which those principles modified themselves depending on elevation and aspect and stone type, and the particular character of each piece of ground. Vera Marsh had asked her to write it down. She was writing it down. Cecilia stayed through that summer and into the following autumn. She had not originally planned to stay so long. She had come for a season and found, as people sometimes find, that the work she had arrived to assist with was not finished in the shape she had expected, and that leaving before it settled into something permanent was not something she was inclined to do. She and Evelyn spent the evenings in the enclosure when the weather allowed the long summer evenings when the light stayed late, and the sandstone cliff above them held the day's warmth and released it slowly through the cooling hours. They talked sometimes about the land and the season and what the next year's growing cycle might produce, about the seed varieties and the soil adjustments and the drainage modifications she was planning for the winter frames. Sometimes they sat without talking. 2 women in a horseshoe of red stone on a Montana evening, the sky above them moving from the bright blue of late summer toward the copper and rose of the sun. Dropping behind the western ridge, the light working its way down the cliff face in a slow recession that neither of them was in a hurry to end. Pastor Owen Cutter delivered a sermon in October that was not the same kind of sermon he had delivered the previous November. He spoke about wisdom proven through endurance, about the particular kind of knowledge that can only be acquired by doing the thing rather than observing the doing of it, about patience as a form of courage that asks more of a person than the more visible kinds. He did not use names. He did not need to. Evelyn was in the congregation that Sunday, which was not always the case. She sat in the 3rd row and listened from beginning to end with the same steady attention she brought to everything she thought was worth attending to. She did not seek him out afterward. He found her at the door as the congregation was leaving and said her name, and what he said after it was brief and said simply, the way brief things are said, when the longer version has already been communicated through other means. He said he had been wrong in his public assessments, and he considered it only fair that the correction also be public, and he intended to see to that. She thanked him for saying so. She meant it. The 2nd winter in the enclosure produced twice what the first had produced, and it did so, beginning in November rather than waiting until January, because the modifications to the drainage and the gravel bed borders and the orientation of the growing frames had given the system a month of additional effective cold weather performance that the first version had not achieved. The miner's lettuce ran 3 full cycles through the season. The mustard, now in its 2nd generation from seed she had selected, specifically for cold tolerance, grew lower and faster and harder than its parents had, as if the selection had worked its way into the plant's understanding of what was expected of it. The frost beans climbed their pole supports earlier than they had the previous year and produced pods that were longer and more substantial, the plant having spent 1 Montana winter learning what it was up against and adjusted accordingly. The 5th ledger filled in December. Evelyn began a 6th. The seed-saving notes occupied an increasing portion of the pages, because the seed was becoming the thing she thought about most. Not the growing, which she understood now well enough to teach and had taught to anyone who came to her gate with a genuine question. The seed itself. the living information carried inside it, the accumulated history of every frost it had survived. In every selection, it had been subject to the knowledge encoded, not in words or numbers, but in the cell-level constitution of a living thing that had been through what the red hollow winters required and had decided generation by generation to keep being alive. You could not write that down the way you wrote down temperature readings, but you could write down how to protect it, how to save it properly and store it correctly and identify the plants worth selecting from and the conditions under which the seed retained viability through the longest winters. You could write down the principles that made the difference between seed that remembered what it had survived and seed that had forgotten. She wrote all of that. On an evening in the last week of December, Evelyn went out to the enclosure alone, as she did most evenings, to check the frames and take the readings and record the numbers while the day's last light remained. The temperature was dropping quickly in the way it dropped in Red Hollow in December, the warmth leaking out of the air with a thoroughness that left no ambiguity about what the night ahead intended. Nell came with her. The old mule moved through the frozen ground with the same unhurried patience that had carried stone sleds down the southeastern slope 14 months before her breath, making slow white shapes in the cold air. And she stopped at the enclosure gate the way she always stopped now, without instruction, and waited while Evelyn went inside. Evelyn checked the frames one by one, lifting the muslin edges, pressing the soil, reading the thermometers. Everything was holding. She moved to the cliff face at the back of the enclosure and pressed her palm flat against the stone, the way she had pressed it the first time on that April evening in 1881, when the rest of the valley had already gone cold and the cliff alone had kept something of the day. The stone was still warm, not warm the way a fire is warm, warm the way it had always been warm in the slow and patient manner of stone that gathers the day and is not finished, giving it back when the darkness arrives. 3 years of observation had not changed what the stone did. They had only changed her understanding of what she was feeling when she stood here. Stone remembers warmth, the way the old remember kindness, longer than anyone expects. She had been thinking about that sentence since Vera Marsh had said it on a snowy December morning 2 years ago, thinking about it the way you think about things that carry more meaning than they deliver immediately, things that tell you something on the surface, and something different beneath that, and something different again when you have been living with them long enough. What Stone remembered it gave back slowly and without drama in the hours when the giving was most needed. Not in the bright part of the day when the sun was doing its own work and the temperature was adequate without assistance. In the dark hours, the cold hours, the hours when everything else had already surrendered to the frost. That was when the stone gave back what it had gathered. That was when it mattered most. She stayed with her hand against the cliff for a moment. Then she walked back to the enclosure gate and stood beside Nell in the cold, her palm still carrying the warmth the stone had given it. The light was entirely gone. The basin lay dark and still beneath the winter sky. But along the slopes and behind the sheds and beside the creek banks, the shapes of other curved walls were just visible in the darkness. Each of them oriented the same direction, each of them, holding what the day had left them. Each of them learning in their first or second season to give it back in the hours when it was needed most. She went inside. She lit the lamp and opened the ledger to the current page and wrote down the evening readings in their proper columns. Temperature at the cliff face. Temperature at the gravel beds. Temperature at the entrance. Wind direction and wind strength. Soil moisture at the 3 frame positions. Seed notes from the collection she had done that morning. Edmund was starting the fire for supper. Cecilia was in the other room, and the quiet sound of her moving about was the sound of a person settled into a place, They had decided sometime in the past year was where they meant to be. The lamp flame steadied. As the draft from the door Evelyn had come in through settled, and the air in the cabin balanced itself again. Outside on the slopes and along the creek banks, and behind the livestock sheds of Red Hollow Basin, more walls now curved quietly toward the evening sun.